Hi, I'm Elin Waterston, and I'm an art quilter, and I'm here today to talk to you about the way that I quilt my art quilts. Generally speaking, I machine quilt, so what we're going to talk about today is machine quilting. Most of the time, I free motion quilt, but I also use a walking foot and do straight line quilting too. So we're going to go over some of those different techniques that you would use to do creative machine quilting. Now, obviously, because I said I'm a machine quilter, the first thing that you need is a sewing machine. And with that, of course, we have needles. So I use quilting needles because they're very sharp. They have a very sharp tip, and they're made to cut through fabric, batting, and fabric. You always have at least 2 layers of fabric when you're quilting, sometimes more if you have applique pieces. So quilting needles are nice and sharp, and they're going to cut through all those layers. Now, size-wise, I use 75/11 because that's a nice average size. If I were to use any heavy fabrics, I would use I would go up a size, which it would be an 80/12. But most of the time, I'm sewing through quilting weight fabrics, so I just use the 75/11. Then, of course, the next thing that you need is thread. And there are a million different kinds of thread. Whatever suits the purpose of your quilt is what determines your thread choice. And when I choose thread, it's an aesthetic decision. It's based on what it's going to look like. There are rayon threads that have a little bit of a sheen, so if I want that, I'll choose a rayon thread. There are cotton threads that are a bit more matte finish, so if I want that, I'll choose a cotton thread. And then there are some variegated threads and fancy threads too. Now, some people choose the needles based on what the thread is that they use. So if they're using a metallic thread, they'll use a metallic needle. If they're using a real heavy thread, they'll use a top stitch needle. But as I say, I usually stick with the quilting needles. And then you have 2 different kinds of feet that you're going to use when you're machine quilting. One is the walking foot, one is the darning foot. The walking foot, which I'm going to explain in detail later, the walking foot is made for straight lines, and it's made so that it feeds the fabric evenly, the top and the bottom fabric evenly, so that you have a nice smooth finish to your quilt top. So that's if you're ever going to do any straight line, geometric shapes kind of quilting. The free motion foot or darning foot, obviously if I call it a free motion foot, it's meant for free motion. So that you use whenever you're doing anything curvilinear or when you want to be able to move the fabric around smoothly underneath the foot. The free motion foot doesn't touch the throat plate, so it allows you to have a little play in your space between the bottom of the presser foot and the sewing machine. So those are the 2 feet that we're going to be using today. Then, of course, because you're quilting and you have fabric and you have the batting in between, I want to talk a little bit about your batting choices. Now, this depends greatly. It varies greatly from project to project. As I said, I'm an art quilter, so everything that I make is meant to be flat. It's meant to be hung on a wall. It's never going to be laundered. It's never going to have moisture touching it. So that informs my decision of what kind of batting I use. So generally speaking, I use all cotton. So that's what this one is. And then they also now have lovely, beautiful, delicious bamboo, which is great. And this one is a combination bamboo cotton. So those are my choices. They're low loft. They're easy to machine quilt through. And they have a nice hand to them, a nice feel to them, and they're really nice to work with. But that's not the only choice. There are a lot of choices out there. Some people prefer wool. Some people want a little bit more loft than I prefer, so that you would go to a polyester in that case. But you need to think about what it is that you're making and what the purpose is of what you're making, and let that help you decide what kind of batting you want. Now, I don't launder, I don't pre-wash my batting because I'm never going to launder my quilts, but that's something to take into consideration too. If you think that whatever you're making with this batting is going to be laundered, then you need to pre-wash the batting because it needs to be prepped for whatever purpose it's going to have. Having said that, even though I don't launder anything, I do know that in the process, when I'm making my quilt, I am going to hit it with the hot iron, and I sometimes will spritz it with water. So I will do that in advance after I cut my batting. I'll give it a spritz, and then I'll take it to the iron and press it before I do any quilting, because it might shrink, and usually especially the all cotton will shrink a little bit when you hit it with the iron, and that's not something that you want to have happen after you've done all your quilting and you give that work that last press. And that is a lesson that I learned the hard way. So now I'm always very careful to make sure that I give it whatever process I'm going through when I'm going to be making my quilt. I go through that process beforehand with the batting. So those are the main things that you need. But then, of course, there are a gazillion tools and notions and gadgets out there to help you with your machine quilting. And I happen not to be a big gadget guy. I kind of like to streamline everything. But there are a couple things that I do employ when I do my machine quilting. One is an extension table for my sewing machine, which you'll see when I go to the sewing machine. You'll see what I mean. But it's just a table that is a portable table that pops onto the arm of your machine, and it broadens your workspace a little. And even though I work small, it's still nice to have a little extra space. And most of us don't have the luxury of having a drop-in cabinet or sewing table where they can get the sewing machine arm flush with the table. Most of us don't have that, including me. And a lot of people that are sewing are moving because their sewing table is their dining room table. So you move it daily sometimes. And the extension table is great because it just pops off and it's real portable. So that's one thing that I would advise that you get, because it's very helpful. And then the other thing is machine quilting gloves. And I use these whenever I'm free motioning. And what they do, they're just little gloves with a little bit of some little sticky dots on them, rubber dots. And that just helps you get a little traction when you're holding on to your fabric. It helps you get a little bit of traction so you don't end up gripping, because sometimes if you don't have that, you start gripping the quilt, and that's not good for your quilting. It's not great for the quilt, and it's not good for your hands. Your hands can get really tense, and you're already kind of hunched over at the machine and working. So anything that relieves that tension a little bit is helpful. There are a whole lot of different brands. I don't have a brand that I necessarily like better than the others with any of the gadgety kind of things. You just want to try a couple things and see what's right for you. As I say, there are a lot of different kinds, and there's some that are just the fingertips. So if you don't like to have the feeling on your whole hand, you can just have the little tips that help you grip a little bit. And other than that, with notions and gadgets, I would just advise you that if you're having some problem while you're machine quilting, if you have something that you're bumping up against all the time that you need to figure out what's going on and how you can make it easier, I would just evaluate what it is, what the point at which you're having trouble is, and then talk to other people, talk to quilting instructors or other students or other quilters, or even go into your local shop and say, this is what I'm having this problem, and what do you recommend? Is there something that you can find me that'll help me make it easier for me to machine quilt? So once you know what you're working with and you have all your materials and supplies in order, then you're ready to move on to the design process. So that's what we'll be doing next.